You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Welcome to the Climate Conversations. I'm Julie Yu, your host, and this week we have a special treat for our listeners. I'm joined by none other than Jack Board, our climate change correspondent. Welcome to the show, Jack.
Hey, Julie. Great to be with you.
You know, it's not often we get to co-host together, but when we do join forces, it's all about, delving into the intricate realm of climate discourse. And today we tackle the upcoming global gathering.
That's right. We're talking about COP28, 28th time. It's taking place this year in Dubai. It promises to be the next big moment in this kind of planet-saving diplomacy.
Both of us are going to Dubai to cover the event, but before that, we thought we'd go through why the summit is really important, what we are looking out for in particular through our reporting. So, Jack, we were both in the desert last year in Egypt. We are heading back to the heat again. Do you again see the shadow of big oil over this COP?
Yeah, I think we can't help but sort of sense that. We haven't really geographically moved that far from Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt last year to Dubai. Definitely one of the biggest questions that's hanging over COP28 is the role of the oil tycoon who's sitting in the conference's biggest chair, Sultan Al Jaber, who is going to preside over the negotiations this time. And at the same time, he remains in his role as the head of the country's national oil company.
Yeah.
So, of course, this is raising plenty of questions and scrutiny for sure. We know that the EU are going to really push hard in Dubai to try and totally phase out what they've called the unabated use of fossil fuels. And of course, we saw in Egypt that oil-producing nations have stood in the way of phasing out fossil fuels. At previous COPs, they've made big pushes to make sure the language in the final agreements have been watered down in concession. And so I'm expecting to see that the same kind of contest. So for you, do you feel like things are better or worse compared to this time a year ago?
I mean, it feels like things have taken a turn for the worse since last year. I'm just looking at the climate front. Scientists and the UN World Meteorological Organization say 2023 is almost certain to be the warmest year on record, following 4 months in a succession of record-breaking heat. And also adding to the challenges, geopolitical conflicts are raising concerns. And we've got an ongoing war in Ukraine and a new conflict in the Middle East. There is worry that these crises might suck up all the oxygen in the room in the Dubai summit, potentially diverting attention from crucial climate actions. And it's a complex situation. So, Jack, what about in your reporting around the region? You've often been on the ground, seeing firsthand the impacts and solutions. Are people really feeling the heat?
I think they are. I spend a lot of months of the year traveling around, especially the Southeast Asia region, seeing how climate change is directly impacting communities. It's undeniable that people are feeling the heat, whether it be people in Singapore who have more expensive energy bills, or you have communities in the Philippines building their house again because it's been destroyed by a typhoon. Even though I think that many people feel very removed from these high-level talks that take place in a different part of the world, I think the consequences do matter. Is that something that you'd agree with?
Yeah, COP summits may come across as just like a talk shop, but decisions made at these conferences can reshape the lives of individuals and businesses. I feel, for example, policies on carbon pricing could shake up how businesses deal with greenhouse gases, and also decision on climate finance could potentially boost funding for climate efforts in developing countries. So, so much to unpack, and we are not doing it alone. We are thrilled to be joined by a special guest, Melissa Lowe, research fellow at the NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions, who's been to an impressive 10 COP events in the past to offer insights into the intricacies, the debates, the tensions, and the hopes that will shape COP28. Welcome to the program, Melissa.
Thanks, Julie, for having me.
Hi, Mel. Now, 10 COPs is a lot. This will be number 11. And I'm sure for you, a lot of them kind of all blend together. Do you actually have a favorite one? I know that they're not really fun things to attend a lot of the time. But was there one where you really saw the value of these global negotiations?
Yes. Well, it's a toss-up between my first ever COP, which was in 2009. This was in Copenhagen. I think many people remember that. And then, of course, the other one was Paris in 2015 when they came up with the Paris Agreement. So those two are very memorable for me. As you say, it's very eye-opening for everyone who's going to COP for the first time. You kind of get butterflies in your tummy and like you don't know what's going to happen. But yeah, so I will say I'm considered perhaps pretty seasoned compared to many other people, but every time I go to a COP, it does get overwhelming.
Yeah.
So you've chosen two with really consequential outcomes.
Yes.
Is that why they're memorable for you? Because at the end of it, you go, wow, okay, actually the world maybe did achieve something here.
Yeah, the first one was actually considered to be almost a failure, right? Copenhagen back in 2009. And I was one of those observers that was kept out of the COP venue, the Bella Center, for a whole week. So I was there for 2 weeks, but I only got to go in for a week. And again, it was my first COP. I was a student, an undergraduate at the time. And it was really disappointing, but the excitement, you can't beat that.
Absolutely. I remember last year when you were giving a preview of COP27, you told me to wear comfortable shoes, and you were
Yes.
right. It was very overwhelming and intense experience as well. But if you're rating COP28, this year's event, on a scale from 1 to 10, with 10 being super crucial, where do you think it stands?
I will say 20. This is such an important COP this year. I can't emphasize that enough. The big thing, obviously, being the global stocktake and funding the Loss and Damage Fund, which was established in Sharm el Sheikh at COP27 last year. So this is a very, very crucial COP. Essentially, we've actually moved into a decade of implementation. So most of the Paris Agreement's rulebook is done, right? And we actually got to get down to the ground and do the difficult work. And in order to do that, we need funding. We need to do a stock take of where we're at. And so this year is going to be the time for that.
So we've mentioned a little bit about the global stock take already, this form of inventory taking at this very crucial moment that you've just outlined. Can you kind of explain about the type of data that's been gathered over the past couple of years, what the final report could mean for, let's say, an individual country that's not doing enough or for the planet as a whole?
So the global stocktake has been taking place for just over 2 years now. It started with a data collection process somewhere in 2021. And people submit all sorts of things, right? So it can be their national plans, it can be their nationally determined contributions. There was a process called like the Talanoa Dialogue. And people sat down together, and after that workshop, they submitted documents to the COP. And there were 170,000 pages worth of documents and data that was collected. And someone put it together. So I think it was the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat, the UNFCCC Secretariat, that put it all together into a short report. I would say relatively short. It's less than 50 pages. It's fairly easy to go through because it's like a summary for policymakers almost. And that's what countries will go to Dubai this year, and they will evaluate that document and say, what do we do next? So we've moved from a data collection engagement to a technical process where they go through some of the options available to countries at this stage in time. And the next step, of course, is political. So we've entered the last phase of the global stocktake, the first ever global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. And countries will need to adopt a decision at the end of the COP this year saying what will they do with this information? Will they take it into their next nationally determined contributions in 2025? And this, of course, will set up the whole process moving forward, right? So if they have a very strong, concrete outcome this year, that should mean that the next global stocktake should also work in a similar fashion. If it fails completely, then it's bad news for the rest of us. We've got to work harder in the next global stocktake, but this is really important. And I think the term that's been bandied around is it's an opportunity for course correction. So if we're not doing as much as we can, or where we need to get to keep ourselves below 1.5 temperature increase, below pre-industrial levels, which is the threshold for runaway climate change. As we know, it's what the science is telling us, we need to take heed of the global stocktake report that's just been released a few weeks ago.
And Melissa, there has also been some movement in the loss and damage space in recent weeks, a massive topic in Egypt that was left unresolved until recently. And it looks like the World Bank could be poised to host the Loss and Damage Fund temporarily for about a 4-year period. What are your thoughts on that? Because there seems to be those who worry that World Bank isn't independent enough, given the US is the largest shareholder.
Yeah, it is very complicated. I did download the report, and I actually have the report in front of me. It's not great news, I have to say. The Transitional Committee met for the 4th time in October this year, And everybody knows they didn't come to a strong conclusion just before COP, and they actually had to organize an extraordinary meeting in Abu Dhabi. And as you rightly point out, the World Bank is an option for countries to have in terms of the operationalization of the loss damage fund. But I think crucially, what's important to get to at this COP is how to fund it. So we don't have conclusion as to what innovative sources are going to be used, whether specific countries are going to be putting money into the fund. The World Bank bit is really just, in terms of how do you disperse the funding in a timely way, and it probably has to be a lot quicker than what the World Bank currently does at this point in time. So how do you make sure the fund goes to the most vulnerable of communities when they need it?
So what seems to be getting in the way? Is it the developed countries just not stepping up? I did see some reports that developing countries and also climate justice activists were pointing the finger at countries like the US and developed countries for playing hardball.
Yeah, loss and damage actually goes way back. And this concern of developed countries that the loss and damage fund is a means to compensate the developing countries for obviously losses and damages that have occurred due to climate change, which is argued by the developing world that is caused by historical emissions, right? So you went through the Industrial Revolution, we did not. You've caused climate change, and now we're suffering the worst effects of it. That kind of conversation is not particularly helpful at these negotiations because, as you say, it points the finger at a certain group of countries. They're also going through these issues, right? We've seen severe weather conditions and floods, heat waves in parts of Europe, and it's going to get worse. So they're also suffering loss and damage. So is it fair for it to be a single directional, rich to poor sort of directional fund? We're not quite sure at this point, of course, but clearly we need to ensure that the fund goes to the most vulnerable, to those who can't fund it themselves, right? So where the money is going to come from, what are these innovative sources that we're talking about? I think some have suggested global bunker fuel taxes, for instance, and some of the other financial instruments. So I think it's going to be an interesting COP. The report doesn't say too much about what the outcome might be. So as we say at the COP, right, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So we really don't know where it's going to take us.
Hello, my name is Steve Lai.
And I'm Teresa Tang, and we are the hosts of CNA Correspondent,
A podcast that takes you to the heart of the work our correspondents do across the globe.
from China's COVID response to the childcare center massacre in Thailand.
And from the fall of Najib Razak to the rise of Anwar Ibrahim as Malaysia's Prime Minister.
We speak to the people at the reporting front lines.
So if you want to know how the biggest global stories unfold, make sure you follow or subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts.
So when you're speaking to people in this region, do you sense a kind of growing frustration that loss and damage is in this stalled state at the moment? Because it felt like an important moment in Egypt to actually get a basic agreement to set up something. And still the progress seems so slim. And the countries in Southeast Asia are really at the forefront of pushing for loss and damage. So yeah, what do you hear when you speak to people in this region?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think the Southeast Asia region is particularly vulnerable to climate change. Many communities still live along the coastlines. Of course, there's also inland issues. But I think we want to get some clarity in general over what the criteria is going to be, right, in terms of who deserves the funding the most. And I think nobody is disillusioned. It has to be the SIDS countries, right, the small island developing states, those most vulnerable to sea level rise. Obviously, climate-induced disasters are a bit tricky to decide the causality of it. You can't always say it's because of climate change. There could be other factors as well.
Yeah.
So I think that's the difficult part that countries will have to assess. But I believe Southeast Asia actually has a regional fund. And so it's not as if we haven't really looked at disaster relief regionally, but this is a global fund. And I think not all countries will be looking globally because we know that it's going to take time to disperse the funding. So maybe the solutions will have to be bilaterally or regionally, and in terms of humanitarian support as well.
Will countries be able to get the fund up and running by 2024?
Probably not 2024. Ideally, there are some sources of funding that will be decided by Dubai this year. But as you know, the COP agenda is very packed, and there's also the Global Goal on Adaptation, the new collective quantified goal that has to be funded by next year or decided by next year from 2025 onwards. And that's a start of US $100 billion. So I think countries will also be anticipating what they need to put forward next year under the new collective quantified goal. So I don't know whether that would mean that they would be hesitant to fund the loss and damage fund this year, because then collectively they're paying through a lot.
Yeah, a really packed agenda to look forward to. We spoke a little bit earlier about the complications of holding COP in the UAE, because their presidency will dictate a lot of the messaging and the agenda this time around. So I just wanted to get your perspective on whether you think it's important that these big oil nations, including those in the Middle East, are prominently included in these talks as kind of drivers of change, cleaning up the dirty industries that still cause so many emissions? Or is it problematic that we have them having so much influence over the direction of the negotiations?
That's a very interesting question. The UAE is hosting this year's COP. So I think there is some concern among green groups, NGOs, for example, that will overshadow the COP proceedings and give businesses in the pollutive sector actually more airtime. However, I've also seen some interesting developments on transparency this time at the COP. So, for the first time ever, countries and NGOs all have to declare conflict of interest. So, in the event that you're being sponsored by perhaps someone from the pollutive industry, you have to declare this. And it will be published completely in the list of participants. So, that's really interesting because it's the first time in my 11 years going to COP and ever since 1994, I believe, that full transparency is required of everyone. So I think we'll be able to assess after this year's COP how many of the 70,000 people actually represent those interests, right? And then we'll have the data to say that. But I think the presidency is very mindful as well to make sure that all stakeholders are brought to the table. And we do know that businesses are an important player. You have to bring everyone along. It's not just governments. Businesses also need to be mindful of the jurisdictions they work in, the NDCs that are out there. And then they also need to develop additional projects if they need to help drive climate action. And there are also a lot of NGOs that are going. So I think the interests will generally be balanced. From the way I look at it, I've looked at the 2-week schedule that the presidency has set out. It's very comprehensive. We start with health, and then there's finance, gender equality, there's energy and industry. I think the big topic this year is going to be a just transition. How do we ensure that economies that are currently still very heavily invested in fossils, how do they ensure that they move people along and bring them along in the just transition, phasing down or phasing out of fossil fuels, right? Because it's still absolutely necessary in a lot of areas in the world where you just can't phase it out straight away. So there's also issues of nature, land use, food and agriculture. And I know that many pavilions that are set up by countries are also following this 2-week agenda, the thematic days as well. So I think that's very promising for this year's COP, although the schedule is already very packed. And I'm just thinking, how am I going to get around Expo City? Comfortable shoes again, Julie, you're going. So the Expo City is apparently very big, and we're just going to have to figure out a way to split our time between the negotiations and the pavilions where a lot of the activity is going to be happening.
So behind the scenes, how much influence do you think the presidency does have over the real nitty-gritty of the negotiations? And we know that these types of big oil producing nations have been obstructionist in the way that the final texts have come out in the past. Can they shape the way that COP is done?
Yeah, absolutely. They do shape the way the COP is run. They do shape the way that the outcomes are framed. But I think we are very mindful. Everyone is super mindful that this is unfolding before our eyes. And I'm sure that the COP presidency also wants to be seen as a fair and just leader. I do believe that it was not by chance that the global stocktake is happening this year when the UAE is hosting, right? It's a real opportunity for them to show leadership. and to show the world that if a country like the UAE was really quite heavily invested in the fossil sector, if they're committed to transitioning and bring people along, bring businesses along. But yeah, a tricky situation to be in for them. And I think all countries will try and support as best as possible. But the presidency also has help. It can't do it alone. So what the presidency of the COP normally does is, and the UNFCCC Secretary will also appoint representative of governments to help them. And obviously, everyone that's being appointed has to be fair and objective. So I think there are safeguards, there are checks and balances within the system that we can feel safe about. So we don't have to worry too much.
And Melissa, on a positive note, there seems to be some promising developments between the US and China that could impact the upcoming COP. I recently spoke to US climate envoy John Kerry during his visit to Singapore, discussing his recent meeting with his Chinese counterpart, Mr. Xie Zhenhua in California, and he described it as constructive. He also pointed to the fact that China just released that long-awaited methane reduction plan at the tail end of their talks. I mean, it's good news, isn't it, when the two largest emitters in the world are sort of making headway in climate cooperation?
Absolutely. I think everyone is very concerned about the geopolitical issues around the world and in the region that we're all going to. So having the US and China come together is, as you say, is very positive. I think the last time they had come up with HFC reduction or phase out, phase down terminology, which was, I think, very, very positive. And around the COP, you do feel the excitement whenever the US and China agree to work together.
What about for this region? Last COP, we saw that not a single national leader from any of the ASEAN countries or from the big polluters, China or Japan or Korea or Australia, even turned up to the Leaders Summit. Do you think that any of them will turn up this time? Do you think it matters? And then what are some of the important issues that could influence this region's the economy or the energy systems or the food systems?
Well, we've entered a decade of implementation, right? And I think that it's also important to realize that we should not be negotiating at that scale that we used to negotiate, especially at Paris, at Copenhagen, or even at Katowice, where we had the rule book that was due. So I think we should also manage our expectations as to whether world leaders are going to be showing up, because this is an important COP. Yes, it's the global stocktake, it's the loss and damage fund, but it's not necessarily a big year in terms of that you have to show up to show people that you're doing something. I think people also are concerned about what's happening back home, COVID, which is obviously coming back in some places, inflation and all that. So I think not everyone's going to make it down to the Leaders Summit. And frankly, I'm not even quite sure if we need a Leaders Summit, right? Especially for observers, sometimes it gets in the way because the UNFCCC bars observers from going in on the first couple of days because of high security. So then you sort of prevent people from going there and meaningfully engaging at the COP. So perhaps it's a bit of a distraction almost, right? Having the leaders there. But in terms of the energy and food systems, I think these are real issues. I think COVID definitely taught us, at least here in Singapore, we know that food security is such a big issue. And with climate change happening, accelerating in some places, we are going to become more water scarce, energy scarce, food scarce in various places. And so I think it's important to develop resilience. And some of these things obviously need to take place locally, regionally, at a subnational level. It can't always happen at the national level. So I think we all need to realize that the COP has its purpose. We go there to negotiate some big picture items, but the work still needs to be done domestically. So what I do want to say is that the 70,000 people that are going to Dubai this year, they have a heavy responsibility on their shoulders when they go back. It's always about coming home to do something.
Yeah, the real work often happens after the conference, right?
That's right.
What about Singapore's role, Melissa? We understand sustainability and the Environment Minister, Grace Fu, will be co-facilitating negotiations on mitigation, and the country is obviously very heavily invested in promoting and facilitating carbon markets. You're part of the delegation. I mean, talk to us about what Singapore will be pushing for.
I'm very excited about Singapore's program at the pavilion this year. This is the second year that Singapore is organizing a pavilion. And in the many years that I've been to a COP, I've always wondered whether Singapore would ever run a pavilion, because it's a great opportunity to showcase what you've been doing and to engage with others for future collaboration and partnership. They do follow the thematic days that the COP presidency has outlined. I believe there'll be some announcements coming up towards the end of the year towards COP as well about perhaps an implementation agreement that we've signed with some countries that we have memorandums of understanding with. in order to trade carbon credits under our Carbon Pricing Act. So that's very exciting. That's an area of research that I'm also working on. But also, as you've mentioned, Minister Grace Fu has been invited by the presidency to co-facilitate a topic that is so important, which is mitigation ambition. And she's doing it with a Norwegian counterpart. And it's especially because the COP is being hosted in the UAE, right? And the topic of just transition is so important that I think mitigation ambition as a topic is so crucial, because countries are going to look around them and say, what is the world looking like right now? Can we realistically increase our ambition in the next 2 years when our next NDCs are due? And I think it has a lot of bearing on what the outcome, the political outcome of the global stocktake is going to look like. Because if you can't agree on mitigation ambition, I don't think the wording of the global stocktake outcome is going to be particularly ambitious. So I think it's almost like a proxy, right? So if you look at where the talks are going on mitigation ambition, then you'll be able to tell whether the sentiment is positive, that we're going to get a strong outcome on global stocktake as well. So I think Singapore is definitely punching above its weight.
Yeah, nice. So then finally, Mel, what do you think it's going to take for COP28 to be considered a global success? And we know that every presidency wants that to happen. They want to have their agreements ticked off, pledges made, and for the whole thing to go smoothly.
A very wise person, actually from the Singapore delegation, told me some years ago that everyone leaves the COP a little bit unhappy. And if you think about it, it actually does make sense, right? Because you have to compromise. When you go to the COP, you have a job to do. You have some interests to protect if you represent a government. And I think a lot of NGOs don't realize that. A lot of us who go there and observe take some time to understand that countries have some what we call red lines that can't be crossed. And those end up in the text as compromise text, right? So it might be a watered down shall to a should. In the larger scheme of things, I think that's fine, as long as we bring everyone along and as long as the text moves action. So there might be some gaps that will have to be filled over time. And the good news is that with the Paris Agreement, there are some safeguards, as I said, put in place. There are reviews that are built in for every 5 years or so. And so some of the reviews will be coming up in 2024 and onwards. So there will still be a need for COP. Definitely after this year, right? And for the foreseeable future, because countries will need to go back to the text and see if it's fit for purpose. So from next year onwards, countries will have to submit biennial transparency reports, and those are due in December next year. So definitely more things to look forward to. But to your question about what would be success for COP28, definitely agreement on funding for the Loss and Damage Fund. We also need a very strong outcome for the global stocktake, and I hope that the political process will be smooth across the 2 weeks. You know, there's always a little bit of drama at the COP, so it's the first global stocktake after all, and I hope people realize that this will set the tone for future global stocktakes. I think every year the COP does disappoint in some ways, but it also surprises in other ways. So I'm going there with an open mind, feeling inspired that we've come some way since Paris. And as I said, this is a year for potentially course correction. So we do need to make sure that we write on the positives and less on the negatives.
Well, yeah, hopefully we'll get to see some ambitious climate goals, as you said, financial commitments and effective implementation to save our planet. Melissa, thank you as always for sharing your insight, your perspective on the intricacies of COP and its quest for success. We certainly look forward to catching up with you in Dubai. And also, Jack, thank you so much for co-hosting this insightful discussion. We'll be doing this again in a few weeks' time, so looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Nice to chat.
Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Stay tuned for our on-the-ground coverage. Jack and I will be bringing you first-hand accounts, interviews, and in-depth analysis from the heart of the summit in Dubai. Now, do remember to like and subscribe to this podcast so you know when the new episode drops. Leave us a message on Spotify or Apple Podcasts to let us know what you think. The team behind this podcast is Sign Win, Jacqueline Chan, Joanne Chen, Tiffany Ang, Crispina Robert, and I'm Julie Yu, signing off.